The year was 1700, and in the gilded, suffocating halls of Madrid's royal palace, courtiers whispered about their king as though he were a walking ghost. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, sat on his throne like a grotesque parody of majesty. Forget the crown jewels and velvet robes. The real show was his face. His jaw jutted so far forward, it looked like he was trying to escape his own skull. He drooled constantly, not with kingly appetite, but because his swollen tongue didn't fit in his mouth. Eating was an Olympic event, and speaking was worse. The most Catholic king, ruler of half the globe, sounded like a gargling drunk every time he tried to form words. Diplomats often required interpreters, even when he was speaking their language. Imagine being so inbred that even your Spanish sounded foreign in Madrid. The Spanish court called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. They muttered about curses, sorcery, and God's punishment. They truly believed demons had chewed on their king before birth. But the real curse wasn't hiding in exorcisms or the devil's fingerprints. No, it was baked into his DNA. A centuries-long math problem of genetic roulette gone spectacularly wrong. Charles was the unlucky jackpot of 200 years of Habsburgs marrying their cousins, nieces, and occasionally, whatever relative was still breathing. He wasn't bewitched. He was the human answer sheet to what happens when you believe your family tree should look more like a noose than a forest, and the numbers don't lie. Modern scientists later worked out Charles's inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, higher than if his parents had been actual siblings. Yes, congratulations, Charles. You were more inbred than incest itself. This wasn't just grotesque biology. It was the collapse of a dynasty. 6 centuries of empire, palaces, armies, colonies, and priests waving incense all undone because the family refused to let outsiders water down their superior blood. Instead of warriors and conquerors, they produced a king who couldn't chew a steak without turning it into soup first. And yet, this freak show wasn't just tragic. It was comic in the darkest possible way. Courtiers really thought exorcisms could cure a jawline so cursed it deserved its own heraldic crest. Priests pressed hot animal guts to his body to restore fertility. Astrologers were paid to chart the stars, while the real disaster was happening in the chromosomes right under their noses. God wasn't punishing the Habsburgs, genetics was. And genetics, unlike kings, doesn't give a damn about crowns, armies, or Catholic dogma. Charles II was not the bewitched king. He was the walking, dribbling corpse of 2 centuries of aristocrats, convincing themselves they were too good to marry anyone but their cousin. His broken body was the royal receipt of that delusion. A dynasty rotting from the inside out. The Habsburg story didn't start with drool and deformities. It started with ambition, scheming, and the kind of marriage strategy that would make modern dating apps crash in terror. Back in the 10th century, the family was small-time nobility in a Swiss canton, lords of a modest castle called Habsburg, Hawk's Castle. Very fitting, since they spent the next 6 centuries circling Europe like hawks looking for fresh prey. Except instead of talons, they used wedding rings. Their family motto summed it up perfectly. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Translation? Why waste soldiers when you can shove your niece at a king and collect land as a wedding gift? Honestly, it was genius. The Habsburgs expanded their empire not with swords, but with marriages so awkward and complicated they made medieval family reunions look like Game of Thrones fanfiction. By 1273, Rudolph II became the first Habsburg to grab the Holy Roman Emperor title. And boy, once they had it, they clung to it harder than Charles II clung to his soup spoon. That shiny crown gave them access to lands, bishops, trade, armies, everything. Think of it as the medieval version of getting admin rights to half of Europe. And once you've got admin rights, the possibilities are endless. Of course, they didn't stop there. Maximilian I, the marriage mastermind, arranged for his son Philip to marry Joanna of Castile in 1496. That single wedding dragged Spain, its booming American colonies, and its mountains of silver into the Habsburg fold. It was the jackpot marriage. Better than a Vegas slot machine, except instead of coins, it spat out entire continents. Suddenly, the Habsburgs were running an empire where the sun never set. Though honestly, with so many cousins marrying cousins, the sun probably should have set on their family tree. Now, Charles V, Maximilian's grandson, ended up inheriting this insane patchwork of territories. Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, the Netherlands, the Americas. Basically, if you threw a dart at a European map, odds were you'd hit Habsburg property. He was the landlord of half the world. The poor guy probably needed 3 calendars just to keep track of tax deadlines. But here's where the comedy kicks in. Even at their peak, the Habsburgs faced the same problem every hoarder does. Too much junk, not enough shelves. Running all these territories was like babysitting 50 screaming toddlers at once. All of them speaking different languages, demanding snacks, and hating each other. Their solution? Keep it in the family. Literally. Cousins marrying cousins, nieces marrying uncles. A wedding schedule so tight it made the family tree look less like a tree and more like a tangled ball of yarn your cat coughed up. And sure, it worked for a while. The marriages tied everything together, kept the empire from splintering, and made the Habsburgs the most powerful dynasty in Europe. But here's the thing. While it was brilliant politics, it was absolute garbage biology. Every time a Habsburg kid popped out, they were less royal heir and more walking experiment in genetic Jenga. Let's pause and laugh, though. Imagine being a Habsburg teenager at the time. You hit puberty, and instead of wondering who you'll meet at the harvest fair, you're flipping through the family chart like, well, I guess I'm marrying my cousin Maria. Again, forget romance. Dinner conversation probably went like, pass the bread, wife. Sure, cousin. Awkward silence. And all of this was perfectly normal to them. To outsiders, it was a bit strange. But inside the dynasty, cousin marriage wasn't just accepted, it was encouraged, practically mandatory, like eating vegetables. Except these vegetables gave you Habsburg jaws and infertility. As the centuries rolled on, their marriages went from clever power plays to desperate exercises in bloodline hoarding. Instead of expanding their empire, they were tightening the noose around their own DNA. The empire stretched from Peru to Prague, from Mexico to Milan. And yet their genetic pool was shrinking faster than wine at a royal banquet. So yeah, in a happy Austria, marry, and marry, and marry again. But what they didn't realize was that behind the pomp and ceremonies, behind the palaces dripping in gold, they were digging their own grave one cousin wedding at a time. By the 15th and 16th centuries, European politics wasn't about candlelit romance, moonlight sonnets, or even whether the bride had all her teeth. It was about one thing: survival. Kings and queens didn't marry for love, they married for land, allies, and the kind of dowry that could fund a small war. For the Habsburgs, this was more than strategy. It was obsession. If marriage was chess, they weren't just playing the game. They were flipping the board, hogging all the queens and saying, checkmate, cousin. Their formula was simple. Don't fight wars if you can just exchange rings and paperwork. At first, this worked beautifully. Philip the Fair married Joanna of Castile, and boom, Spain. Its mountains of silver and half the New World fell into Habsburg hands. Other marriages roped in Portugal, England, and France. Honestly, Tinder has nothing on this level of matchmaking. Swipe right on your cousin and gain a continent. That was the Habsburg dating app. But here's where things started to get weird. And by weird, I mean downright incestuous. Instead of marrying foreign princesses, they began looking inward. Like really inward. Their goal? Don't let outsiders mess with their precious bloodline. The solution? Marry your niece, or your cousin, or both, depending on who was still alive. Suddenly, their weddings weren't about expanding the empire, but about protecting it from themselves. Take Charles V, for example. He married his first cousin Isabella of Portugal. His son, Philip II, clearly thought that was a winning move, so he married his first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal. Then for variety, he married his niece, Anna of Austria, who was 21 years younger, because nothing screams romance like saying uncle husband at the altar. Now picture Christmas dinner at the Habsburg Palace. Pass the salt, wife. Yes, uncle. And can you hand me the bread, cousin? I mean, the family tree didn't branch. It curled back in on itself like a pretzel. Philip III wasn't about to break the cycle either. He married his second cousin, Margaret of Austria. Their son, Philip IV, married his first cousin, Elizabeth of France. When she died, he doubled down and married his niece, Mariana of Austria, who was 30 years younger. At this point, even the family dog was probably wondering if it was next in line for marriage negotiations. Now people weren't stupid. Courtiers did occasionally whisper, hey, maybe this cousin marrying thing isn't great for the kids. But the Habsburgs brushed it off. Their logic: our bloodline is too superior to get damaged. Right. Tell that to Charles II's jaw. Spoiler, biology doesn't care how shiny your crown is. Let's be honest, though. Part of the comedy here is how organized they were about it. They had elaborate genealogical charts, entire teams tracking family lines to make sure they didn't marry too close. The Catholic Church allowed cousins or even uncles and nieces to marry, so the Habsburgs happily complied. What the church didn't do was consult a biology textbook. Genetics doesn't hand out Catholic exceptions. Two cousins producing a kid doesn't magically become safe just because the priest says, "Amen." And yet, the Habsburgs believed they were improving their bloodline by concentrating it. Imagine pouring the same glass of spoiled milk back into the same jug for 200 years and calling it vintage. That was the Habsburg strategy. As the gene pool shrank, the marriages got stranger, the age gaps grew wider, and the heirs came out looking more like tragic science experiments than princes. Every generation pulled the DNA tighter, like stretching a rubber band further and further, until eventually it snapped. Still, the absurdity is worth laughing at. Imagine being a Habsburg teenager back then. Your parents hand you a family chart and say, "Son, pick a bride." "But father, they're all my cousins." "Yes, now pick the prettier one." By the mid-16th century, the whole empire was basically run like a private Habsburg daycare. The ruling class was recycling its own DNA with the kind of commitment usually reserved for compost bins. And while it seemed practical, land stayed in the family, power stayed concentrated. What they were really doing was creating a dynasty that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own genetic arrogance. Because here's the punchline. Every crown, every jewel, every empire conquered, every colony stolen, all of it meant nothing when the royal baby arrived with a jaw that could scare a horse. The empire spanned continents, but the family tree was rotting at the roots. To understand the tragedy of the Habsburgs, you've got to understand genetics, or as they would call it, that invisible thing we don't care about because God loves us. Every human gets 2 copies of each gene, one from mom, one from dad. Normally, this is great news. If dad's got a messed up recessive gene, mom's dominant one usually masks it, and the kid turns out fine. But when mom and dad are closely related, surprise! The kid gets 2 copies of the bad gene. And instead of masking the problem, the body says, "Congratulations, you now unlock the bonus level of deformities." Geneticists call this inbreeding coefficient. It's basically a score that tells you how much of your DNA is identical because your parents were related. For unrelated parents, the number is 0. For first cousins, it's around 0.0625. For siblings, it's 0.25. Now brace yourself. Charles II of Spain clocked in at 0.254. That's right. He was more inbred than if his parents had been brother and sister. That's not just a statistic. That's a family tree collapsing into a family noose. And it didn't happen from one bad marriage. Oh no, this was centuries in the making. Charles's family tree looks less like a tree and more like a spider web drawn by a drunk toddler. The same ancestors pop up again and again. Philip II shows up 14 times in his lineage. Charles V shows up 8 times. That's not a family tree. That's a recycling chart. Here's where the funny part comes in. Imagine introducing yourself at a party. "Hi, I'm Charles II. My great-great-grandfather is also my great-uncle, and my grandmother shows up 8 times. What's your family like?" Everyone else would have dropped their goblets and left the room. But the Habsburgs weren't worried. They thought they were breeding superior stock. In reality, they were breeding the genetic equivalent of Windows Vista: glitchy, slow, and guaranteed to crash. The consequences were exactly what biology predicts: deformities, weak immune systems, and fertility problems. The famous Habsburg jaw, that monstrous underbite, became the family's signature brand, like a genetic logo stamped on every chin. Eating was difficult, speech was nearly impossible, and portraits of Habsburg rulers slowly turned into a gallery of drooling, lantern-jawed aristocrats. Now, if you're thinking, well, that's just one bad trait, oh no, it gets better. Hydrocephalus, fluid swelling in the brain, cropped up in the bloodline. Some kids were born with abnormally large heads and severe cognitive issues. Others were stunted or bent, or had joints that collapsed before they hit 30. Skin diseases, eczema, weird pigmentation. The royal court started to look less like a glamorous pageant and more like the waiting room of a very unlucky doctor's office. And let's not forget fertility. Miscarriages skyrocketed, infant mortality became the family hobby. And even when a child survived, They often carried the same baggage of deformities and weakness. The genetic spiral was tightening, each generation worse than the last. It's like watching a dynasty speedrun its own extinction. Now for a laugh, and because this mess is darkly hilarious, imagine being a Habsburg court doctor. You're summoned to examine the newborn prince. You walk in, see the jaw, the eyes, the limp body, and think, yep, still cousins. But you can't say that out loud, so you mumble something about divine mystery, prescribe leeches, and build a crown for your silence. Modern geneticists have confirmed what everyone at court suspected but refused to admit. This was one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding in recorded history. Spanish geneticist Gonzalo Alvarez and colleagues mapped out 3,000 Habsburgs over 16 generations. The math was brutal. The closer the marriages, the higher the disabilities. The higher the disabilities, the faster the dynasty crumbled. And here's the kicker. The effects weren't immediate at first. Early on, cousin marriages produced heirs who looked fairly normal. Maybe a hint of jaw, maybe a limp. But as the centuries piled up, the damage compounded. By the time Charles II showed up, he wasn't a king. He was a genetic warning label with a crown. Think of it like stacking bad photocopies. The first copy looks okay, the second a little faded. By the 10th copy, the paper's smeared and unreadable. The Habsburgs kept photocopying themselves until the final product was Charles II. A monarch so defective his own body was practically a rebellion. And through all this, the Habsburgs clung to their belief. Their blood was too pure, too superior to ever be broken. They weren't just wrong. They were spectacularly, laughably wrong. Their obsession with keeping power in the family literally bred them into extinction. If the Habsburgs had a family logo, it wouldn't be a crown or a hawk. It would be that legendary jaw. The infamous Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism if you want to impress your dentist, became the dynasty's most famous trademark. Forget family crests. This jaw was so recognizable it could have been on the royal coins. Except instead of inspiring awe, it inspired pity, confusion, and probably the occasional gag reflex. At first, the jaw was just a minor quirk in portraits of early rulers. You'd notice a little protrusion, a chin that looked a bit overeager. Nothing major. But over the centuries, as the inbreeding compounding worsened, the jaw mutated into something monstrous. By the time Charles II was drooling on the throne, it wasn't just a feature, it was the main event. His face was basically 90% jaw, 10% oh God, help him. Ambassadors gave us the best comedy in their horrified descriptions. One Venetian envoy wrote that Charles swallows all he eats whole, for his nether jaw stands so much out that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet. Translation: the King of Spain ate like a snake. Meanwhile, French courtiers said food just slid out of his mouth mid-meal. Imagine being a guest at his dinner table. Duck confit flying across the table as His Majesty attempts a chew. Bon appétit indeed. The deformity wasn't just cosmetic. It made basic survival tasks, chewing, speaking, swallowing, nearly impossible. His speech was so garbled that interpreters were required, even when he spoke his own language. That's when you know things have gone downhill, when the King of Spain needs subtitles in Madrid. But the jaw was only the headline act. The Habsburgs collected deformities like trophies. Hydrocephalus, for instance, popped up repeatedly. That's when fluid builds in the skull, making heads abnormally large and brains tragically fragile. Several Habsburg children had it, many dying young, others surviving but unable to function. And remember, these were supposed to be future kings and queens. Instead, the royal nursery looked like a warning poster for genetic counseling. Add to that skeletal problems. Some were freakishly tall, others pathetically short, many hobbled by arthritis before they even hit adulthood. The famous Habsburg walk wasn't a strut of royalty. It was a wobbly shuffle, like they were all permanently seasick. If you saw them approach, you didn't think, here comes majesty. You thought, here comes a lawsuit waiting to happen. And the skin. Reports mention eczema, strange blotches, odd pigmentation, premature aging. Royal portraits show pale, waxy faces that looked more corpse than king. Imagine commissioning a grand oil painting of your ruler only to realize it resembles a wax figure melting in the sun. Not exactly inspiring confidence. Now let's sprinkle in fertility issues. Royal marriages were supposed to pump out heirs like a medieval baby factory. Instead, miscarriages, infant deaths, and barren unions became the Habsburg tradition. The wombs of their queens became tombs, and the royal bedchamber produced more heartbreak than heirs. For a dynasty obsessed with bloodline survival, this was the ultimate cosmic joke. And speaking of jokes, imagine the royal midwives. Every time a child was born, they probably braced themselves. Okay, place your bets, folks. Will this one walk, talk, or just drool like the rest? Spoiler, most drooled. The most tragic and an unintentionally comedic symbol of this genetic circus was Charles II himself. Born in 1661, the poor man was the end product of centuries of bad marriages. His jaw was so gigantic he couldn't chew solid food. His tongue so swollen he drooled constantly. He spoke so poorly that even Spanish nobles whispered, "What language is that?" He stood barely 5 feet tall, hunched like an old man, trembling hands useless for signing royal documents. His body was a medical puzzle, his mind childlike, his mood swinging from tantrums to despair. And yet this man ruled half the globe. Doctors and priests tried everything: exorcisms, animal entrails slapped onto his chest, bizarre potions. If it was weird and disgusting, they tried it. Astrology charts were drawn, rituals performed. Meanwhile, the real answer was screaming in their faces: stop marrying your cousins. But no, easier to blame the devil than admit your dynasty was eating itself alive. Even Charles's autopsy after death turned into grotesque comedy. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, intestines rotted, and he had only one blackened testicle. Spain's most powerful monarch, reduced in death to a list of medical oddities fit for a carnival sideshow. The royal pathologist might as well have stamped his report: cause of death, cousins. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a deformity, it was a warning label carved into human bone, a grotesque punchline written across centuries of royal arrogance, and no amount of crowns, gold, or holy relics could hide the truth. The most powerful dynasty in Europe was literally eating itself from the inside out. By the late 17th century, the Habsburg dynasty wasn't just declining, it was collapsing like a drunk uncle at a wedding. Charles II, the walking genetic caution sign, had dragged the family name to the brink. His inability to produce an heir didn't just doom his personal reign, it lit the fuse on a European powder keg. The Spanish Empire, with its colonies, silver, and global reach, was now up for grabs. And all because centuries of cousin weddings had produced a king who couldn't father a child if you gave him step-by-step instructions. Courtiers panicked, priests prayed, doctors prescribed, let's just say, creative remedies. One treatment involved slapping hot animal guts on his body to restore fertility. Yes, you read that right. The most powerful empire in the world was relying on medieval sausage therapy to save itself. Spoiler, it didn't work. As Charles drooled and stumbled through his reign, Europe sharpened its knives. France wanted Spain, Austria wanted Spain, England wanted Spain. Everyone wanted a piece of the crumbling Habsburg pie, and Charles, in his lucid moments, knew his death would unleash chaos. He changed his will more often than he changed his shirt, which, given his condition, probably wasn't very often. In 1700, at the age of 38, Charles II finally gave up the ghost. His death was less tragedy and more inevitability. The autopsy revealed the horror show his body had become: a heart the size of a peppercorn, intestines rotted, lungs corroded, and a single black testicle, black as carbon. Imagine being the royal doctor forced to write that down. Yes, sire, the king's crown jewels were literally coal. With Charles gone, Europe exploded into the War of the Spanish Succession. From 1701 to 1714, battlefields from Flanders to the Caribbean ran red with blood. Estimates range from 400,000 to over 1 million dead, all because one man couldn't produce an heir. Think about it. The fate of continents hinged on a jaw, a tongue too big, and some very uncooperative reproductive organs. If that's not dark comedy, nothing is. The treaties of Utrecht, 1713, and Rastatt, 1714, carved up Spain's empire like a Thanksgiving turkey. France got its Bourbon prince on the throne, Austria grabbed slices of Italy and the Netherlands, and Britain picked up Gibraltar and Minorca, their first real estate in the Mediterranean. The once mighty Spanish Habsburgs, extinct, gone, wiped out by their own family planning strategy, which was less planning and more genetic Russian roulette. But don't think the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs was laughing. They inherited some territory, but also the same cursed DNA. Their rulers still limped, drooled, and died childless with alarming frequency. Sure, they lasted longer, all the way to 1918, but the dynasty was more zombie than empire by then. World War I was the final nail in their coffin. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated, and the last Habsburg emperor, Charles I, packed up his jawline and left the stage. The irony? When Maria Theresa came along in the 18th century and married outside the family, things actually looked up. 16 kids later, the dynasty briefly convinced itself it had dodged the curse. But even then, the echoes of centuries of inbreeding haunted her children. From infertility to instability, to poor Marie Antoinette losing her head in France. Literally, talk about losing your inheritance. By the time Franz Joseph ruled in the 19th century, the Habsburg story was less about glory and more about tragedy porn. His son committed suicide, his wife was assassinated, and his heir, Franz Ferdinand, was shot in Sarajevo, triggering World War I. It's almost poetic. The family that once controlled the world unraveled so spectacularly that its name became synonymous with decline. And through it all, the lesson was staring them in the face. Biology doesn't care about crowns. Genetics doesn't bow to popes, priests, or emperors. You can own half the planet, but if your kids keep marrying their cousins, the math will eventually eat you alive. The Habsburgs ignored that rule, and their dynasty paid the price. Now, for a joke break, imagine Charles II as the world's worst motivational speaker. If I can rule an empire drooling and eating soup through a straw, you too can achieve greatness. Inspiring? Number? Terrifying? Absolutely. Today, scientists use the Habsburgs as a case study for inbreeding depression. Geneticists point to their family tree, with ancestors appearing over and over, as a warning. The Habsburg jaw isn't just a deformity, it's a symbol of arrogance, of power so drunk on itself it refused to learn the most basic biological lesson. Don't marry your niece. In the end, the Habsburg dynasty wasn't destroyed by war, plague, or revolution. It was destroyed by dinner table conversations that went, "So, cousin? Yes, cousin. Excellent. Let's wed." 6 centuries of power, undone by genetics, arrogance, and a jaw that couldn't chew. That's the Habsburg tragedy and comedy. Proof that you can conquer the world, but you can't conquer biology. So here's the punchline. The Habsburgs didn't need enemies, assassins, or rebels. They killed themselves with wedding rings. While armies fought outside their castles, the real war was happening in their bedrooms. And the enemy was their own DNA. Centuries of cousin-loving produced heirs who couldn't chew their food, couldn't speak their language, and in Charles II's case, couldn't even father a child. The Spanish Empire collapsed not with a bang, but with a drool. Think about it. A dynasty that once ruled continents was reduced to jaws so big they scared diplomats, testicles black as coal, and autopsy reports that read like grotesque jokes. If biology gave out medals for self-destruction, the Habsburgs would have swept the podium. And that's the haunting comedy of it all. 6 centuries of glory, armies, gold, and crowns, brought down by a family tree so tangled it strangled itself. The Habsburgs didn't just fall. They face-planted into history, jaw first.